So during this webinar, you should see a window where you can fill in questions. Carrie here in our office is a panelist on this meeting and will be observing those questions and answering them as they come in. I will also address the questions verbally here as they're important. So please do not hesitate to ask a question at any time during the webinar. Again, as I just mentioned, we're going to be going over a bit of a mile-high overview to get everyone up to speed on the basics of the software. So with that, let's begin. You'll notice that iNPUT-ACE is broken up into a few different tabs that can be accessed along the left-hand side of the interface. The main tab that appears when you first launch iNPUT-ACE is the Interrogate tab. This tab handles the playback and metadata analysis of a file. So let's begin by taking a quick peek at this Interrogate tab. I've got a very basic file that I'm going to simply select and drag into the file list. Once that file is in the file list, you will not only see a new group appear with the item identified via its name, you can also expand that item and view the different video streams and audio streams that are a part of that file. Also in the file list is an icon symbolized as an eye in the file list, and when clicked will interrogate that file. The interrogation process contains several different features. One is a playback window that appears here with a play button, as well as some metadata information, for example, the file hash in MD5, as well as metadata relating to the video stream and the audio stream in this particular file. We're going to come back to the metadata analysis portion at a later point in this webinar, but for now, let's take a look at what happens when we click the play button. You'll notice now that we're presented with some controls for the playback. For example, there's a play and pause button here, as well as frame stepping backwards and frame stepping forwards. These hotkeys are also mapped to the keyboard on the left arrow key, which I'm holding down right now, and the right arrow key, which I'm holding down here. The same action occurs when clicking these buttons back and forth. You'll also see some additional metadata about the current frame, its picture type, in other words, I, B, or P, which again will go into pretty significant detail on what this all means in the two-day class, but I'll gloss over that for now. You'll also see information related to the current position in terms of time, if available. I'll show other files later on in the webinar where time is not available, and this area presents a percentage into the file instead of in terms of time. We also have the position, which is the byte position inside of the file at the binary level. Again, we'll show more detail about this at a later point in time. The power of iNPUT-ACE really is the speed of getting files in, doing whatever is necessary for your workflow, and getting files out so that they can either be disclosed or included within a PDF narrative report. For this particular case, what I would like to do here is take a clip of the file that is important and disclose this in a manageable format for either an investigator or an attorney, or if you're Canadian, Crown. And so what I'm going to do right now is create what's called a subclip from a section of time within this video file. As I'm scrubbing through this timeline by clicking and dragging on this cursor, we'll see that there's an impact of a vehicle that drives in front of the train tracks. If I want to create a clip of just that point in time, I can create an in mark with my I key on the keyboard, and that mark will appear along the left-hand side of the frame here as well. If I frame step backwards, you'll notice that the in mark disappears. If I frame step forwards that position, that mark is there. Just a visual note to myself to see that that frame is marked. We will also see in the timeline a little tick denoting where the in mark is. And we can actually zoom into the timeline to see a more finite region of space by clicking and dragging on this bar over here on the left-hand side of the timeline. I can get a much smaller region of time that will allow me to more easily and effectively scrub back and forth or manage the data in this area. I can then begin playing again either with the space bar for play pause or by clicking on this icon. Let's watch through the events. And when complete here, I'm going to hit the spacebar again to pause. And now I'm going to mark an out with my O key. This has now sectioned a period of time between that in and out, which we can see here denoted with the gray area in the timeline. And I can snap back and forth between my in and my out mark using the Q and the W keys. So there's Q and there's W. And now we can go back and forth quite easily between those frames. If I want to create that as a section of video, as a subclip, and then process that out to a new format, I'm going to strike the S hotkey to make a subclip, and I'm just going to call this impact. I'll ignore description for now, but we'll talk about what that means at a later point in the webinar. And when I say OK, what we'll notice is a new item is going to appear in the file list. It's going to get put into a new group called subclips, and I could change that here and put it into the same group that already exists through the drop-down right here. But I'm going to leave this as the default, which is to add it to a new group called subclips. So when I say OK, we'll now see a new group called subclips and a new item in the file list called impact. That item can now be managed just like any other item in the file list. It can be moved to a new group by clicking on it and dragging it to a new group. Same with the other file. I can also now take this to any other tab in the in iNPUT-ACE and interact with it. So for example, if we go over to our workflow tab, we can now define workflows to process that file into any desirable format. The workflow tab is really the meat and potatoes of the iNPUT-ACE interface. It allows us to design a variety of processes and output them into a desired format. So for example, if we go back to the interrogate tab here, we'll notice that this file is playing back at half vertical resolution, which is a very common thing that we see. And again, we'll go into more detail in the two-day class about how to handle this type of file format. But we'll see here that the pixel dimensions are 704 pixels across by 240 pixels up and down. In reality, what would have been recorded was something more akin to 704 by 480. And what we can do here is correct this, at least in terms of the vertical resolution, not including, obviously, display aspect ratio issues, but simply for the sample of what would have been recorded by the DVR. So what I'm going to do is create a quick workflow to double all of the lines of video to create an output file that is 704 by 480. And that's a very easy process of simply toggling to the workflow tab, adding a filter to my workflow to resize the file, clicking on the item in the file list, and once clicked on, you'll see that this area is highlighted with a cyan outlining and includes a crosshair when I hover over this boulder area here on the right-hand side. I can then connect this file to the resize node by clicking and dragging, and you can see that we can click and drag anywhere within the workflow tab. Hovering over the circle on the left-hand side of the node and letting go. Once I let go here, we'll see that the input file is connected to a processing node. A processing node is anything that can be added to the workflow tab via the two drop-down menus for filters or advanced processes. Once connected, I can now drag that file to anywhere and it will stay fused with my input file. If needed, I can delete either the node by selecting the node and clicking the delete button, which gets rid of the node as well as the line connection. Or I can delete just the line connection by selecting the line and hitting delete. That maintains the node in my workflow but deletes the connections. I'm going to reconnect that, go into the settings of the resize node, and now I can define any changes that I'd like to make to this file. So I can change the width if necessary and the height. Now, in this case, all I want to do is change the height to 480, and I'll see a preview of what that's going to look like on the output. Under interpolation method for this example, I'm going to select nearest neighbor. Again, we'll go into much more detail in the two-day class about what that means and when to use it. And now what we can see is that the file is going to go through resize, get line doubled, in other words, resized via nearest neighbor, and now we need to direct this to something. To do this, I'm going to select an output format. In this case, I'm just going to select AVI and leave the default set, which are to go to an uncompressed video with uncompressed audio. I can now browse to an output location using the button right here to click into the Windows browser. And I'm simply going to direct this right now to an outputs folder on my desktop. And I'll just call this impact. Once set, I can say OK, and now I can connect any input file or any processing node to that output. So this workflow is now ready. This says take the input file, resize it to 704 by 480, and go out to an uncompressed AVI into my outputs folder directory. I'm going to go open up my outputs directory so we can watch that get built. Let me just delete the file that's in there right now. And now when I say execute workflow, we'll see very quickly that a new file is going to get written into the output directory that has now been resized to 704 by 480 and line doubled. So if we play this back now, we'll see that it's been resized, includes just the area that we selected from in to out, and has uncompressed video and uncompressed audio. So that's the first very simple workflow that we're going to build during this webinar. We'll get into some more complicated ones before the end. And then, of course, the real power of this is the ability of saving these complicated workflows and reusing them in the future. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to clear out everything in my iNPUT-ACE window here, both the items that are in the workflow tab via the processing node and the output node. And then I can also clear out the items in the file list by clicking on them and selecting delete. I can select both items using the control key, and I can delete both at once by selecting both and saying delete. That has now cleared out my file list and cleared out the workflow tab. All right, so with that brief introduction in place, let's take that to the next step. iNPUT-ACE is able to automatically identify codecs and proprietary codecs to play back multimedia from a large variety of sources. In our world, as forensic video analysts and technicians, we frequently see media with extensions that don't make sense to Windows. For example, .dat, .dav, .vam, .s, etc., through some of the more normal ones like .avi. And the real trouble historically with these file formats is that they can't be played back with traditional players. VLC, Windows Media Player, etc., cannot play this type of media back. And what we can do within iNPUT-ACE, though, is select all of the items, simply drag them into the file list, and iNPUT-ACE will automatically identify codecs to play back the media. Once the codecs have been identified, we can now click the interrogate button. We can see the video stream information as well as the file information that we discussed earlier, and we can now play it back just like any other file that would be more normal, like .avi, for example. So we can see here that the .dce file now plays back. The same file we looked at before, the .avi, again is in here and can play back. And now we can organize these files based off our case needs. So if I wanted to create a new group, I'll just simply call this group 2 as an example. We can now select multiple items with the shift and the click and can drag them into a new group for organizational purposes. However, some files, as you may have noticed when dragging them in, took a couple of additional seconds before identifying a codec to play back. This happens in cases when iNPUT-ACE needs to force an input video codec. So I can access the settings for a particular file by clicking on the settings icon next to the file name, and that will open up the ability of changing the frame rate of the file and changing a force input video codec option. So for example, this 01.dat file, iNPUT-ACE has identified that it requires forcing MPEG-4 visual to play the data back, and we can see that now when we interrogate that file, we can interrogate it successfully. Other files, like for example the file that we looked at originally here, which is the train video with that impact, if I look at the settings for that, it's simply using an auto force input video codec option. This can be manually changed as a user if you want to force an option that is different than what iNPUT-ACE automatically identified. So for example, this .vam file in the list, if I try to interrogate that file, we'll notice that it's not interrogating back anything that is meaningful. It's a black screen. It's identified it as being AAC audio, but we're not getting any meaningful data out of this. So what I might like to do as a user is go and try different forced settings to attempt and change what iNPUT-ACE is using to see if something else might be a better tool to handle this task. So if I go into the settings option, I can come down here to my forced input video codec and change it to any other codec that we have currently in the options. In this case, if I select M4V and say OK, we'll notice that it's changed its understanding of the file to being a video stream that can be interrogated, and we can now see meaningful data. Once we have concluded anything that we want to do on the Interrogate tab, we can now go process those items on the Workflow tab, just like we did in the past. Right now, what I'd like to do is batch process all of the items in the file list to, and I'll go as another example here, just to uncompressed AVI for the sake of making this quick. And what I'd like to do is name all of my output files the same name as the input file. So what I'm going to do here is check the include input file name option, which will basically append any output name that I give in the browsing with the name of the original file. I'm going to now browse to that same outputs directory, and I'm simply going to name this underscore. The reason for calling it underscore is that the name of the file will now ultimately be the name of the original file followed by an underscore. So in the case of the 01.dat item, it will be called 01_.avi. Once I say OK here, I'm going to go clear out the outputs folder again by deleting that impact file I created earlier. And now we can connect any one of these files up to the output-to-AVI node. The hierarchy of the organization within the file list is such that when sending a group, by clicking on a group and clicking on this connection area and dragging that to the output node, this action really means process all files within the group to the output AVI settings that we have selected. So this is going to produce however many files this is, 12 files or so, 12 different output files, all with the same settings. I can do the same action by clicking on group 2 and clicking and dragging that to the output to AVI. So this workflow now says, basically, process all files in the file list to output to AVI. So all files in group 1 and all files in group 2. So that when I say execute, this is going to batch process all of those files based on my settings. So we can see here now that the outputs are getting produced quite quickly. And within a matter of seconds here, we'll be done and have an output folder that has processed all of those files. So even as these are coming in, I can now right-click on these and play these with anything that can open up an uncompressed AVI. For example, QuickTime, which again we have some, for those of you who are following the Forensic Video Listserv, I'm sure you're aware of some of the issues right now with running QuickTime on Windows-based operating systems. But again, we'll come to stuff like that in the 2-day class. So the benefit of doing this into more normal file formats is what at one point was a large variety of unplayable files is now a homogenized single file format and codec that can be played with traditional players. So disclosure is now much easier, but we haven't changed a single pixel value in the original files by going out to an uncompressed output. Okay, I'm going to delete these files here and show another quick mechanism that we can process files by. Instead of sending the group to the output node, I can send the files by clicking on a file and shift-clicking to any other file. We now see that there are a large number of connection areas that become available, and by clicking and dragging on any one of those to the output node, it will create a connection from all of those to the output. So this particular workflow right here, sending all of these files to the output node, is the exact same thing as sending just the group to the output node. This is beneficial in a lot of ways. It allows us to process certain items. For example, if I wanted to resize these files, I could resize these items in the group and go out to AVI. And these files I could not resize and just simply go directly to my output to AVI. So a workflow like this is going to say resize all of these files and go onto uncompressed AVI, and these files just go to uncompressed AVI. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about how to effectively use more complicated workflows with things like advanced processes that might consume the inputs. I'm going to clear out the workflow and interrogate tab here again. And let's take a quick look at a slightly more detailed approach on what's available on the interrogate tab. I'm going to take a look at an AVI file right here. Again, dragging and dropping that into the file list. And we can also, I'm going to delete that real quick here and show another way of getting files in. To skip the step of dragging into the file list and then interrogating, we can actually drag the file directly into the white space here, and that will automatically both add it to the file list and interrogate the file. All right, I'm going to play the file to an area of importance here and click the pause button and do a little bit of a more thorough approach on identifying metadata within the file. First off, I'm going to open up a notepad here and show that the file information, like the file hash, can actually be copied out of the UI by selecting the item, using Control-C on your keyboard to copy, and then pasting that into any other file. It's a quick way of reporting on metadata like the file hash in this case. We can also, using the same mechanism, select multiple items, in this case the file name, file size, and file hash, and I can Control-C again, and then paste that into my notepad and have all three items here pasted for reporting purposes. We'll also notice that there is an option over here for saving the frame analysis. If I click that option right here, this is going to go through and create a very detailed metadata analysis of every single frame of video and audio in the file. I'll throw this to my outputs. I'll just call this frame analysis. And this will automatically launch in Excel when complete. Again, it doesn't take more than a couple seconds. And we'll see a very large amount of information. For example, we can see the picture type, so the recording of the GOP length, or the group of pictures length, starting with an iframe and a large sequence of consecutive p frames. We can see that this is a very, very large GOP, which may have implications on our analysis and investigation later on down the road. We also can see information about, for example, the size of the frame. So this is the amount of, this is the location of the frame in terms of bytes. This here is the size of the frame in terms of bytes. So we can see that the iframe takes a lot more data to store that frame relative to the subsequent p frames, which is something what we would expect to see in this file. Using the packet position here, which is the byte position in the file, is a very effective way for us to interrogate certain frames and get more information out of it based on what's reported on the interrogate tab. So for example, I can see that exact same value, the packet position or the byte position, here in the timeline. So this is 23,752,500 bytes into the file is this frame. I can copy that position by right-clicking and saying copy. And now I can go to my Excel spreadsheet and I can find, with Control-F, I can find that same value, and I can paste that in here, and it will snap me automatically to that exact frame of video in the file. So if I wanted to learn more information about the file, this is a very effective and quick way of getting more metadata in the file. An additional way of getting metadata from the file is by going into one of the third-party file metadata tools that we have available within iNPUT-ACE, like the hex tool, and we can snap that exact same frame and learn information at the binary level of the file. So if I want to go to that exact same frame, I can go to my offset by double-clicking here in the bottom left-hand corner, choosing a decimal offset, and pasting in the value that I copied from the interrogate tab. When I say OK, this now snaps me to that exact frame of video in the file. So I can say that within iNPUT-ACE, this frame is located exactly here at the binary level of the file. This is valuable for a lot of reasons, one of which is, in this particular case, the timestamp of the file is logged right in hex. So I can see that that frame is purported to be recorded at 10:32:52 and 666 milliseconds. There's a lot of other ways that this metadata analysis approach is effective that we go over in the 2-day class, but I'm going to stop at the surface level here and kind of move on. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them along the way. If not, I'm going to just continue cruising right through this. Okay, let's go over some additional workflows and slightly more complicated ones. I'm going to take this .h264 file and drag that into the file list. We can see here that when we play the file, this time we see a identification of the location of that frame in terms of a percentage value instead of a timing value. On the past cases, we've seen all of the timing references, which give us an understanding of how much time is purported to have elapsed. In many cases, though, we do not have that value. A lot of the time that value is coming from the container or from metadata that's explicitly written into the file. And in most cases where we have unstructured, for example, H.264 bit streams, we won't have access to information that relates to the timing. So instead, we have a percentage of how far into the file that is. I can still scrub through the file just like we could see on files that had timing, and I can still mark subclips. In this particular case, what I'd like to do is get a slightly more clarified view of this vehicle that's parked right here. This is a homicide case that we worked on last year where the vehicle had some unique features at the back end, and the known vehicle was being compared to a vehicle that was parked next to the house. So what I'm going to do is create another subclip by marking an N with the I key and an O with the O key. And again, I'm just scrubbing through the timeline by clicking here at various places. I'm going to mark S to again create a subclip. I'm going to call it clip and say OK. And I'm now going to go build a workflow that will help clarify the image of that vehicle. So first what I'm going to do is create a filter to crop out the area of the vehicle just to save some processing time and space. I can go into the settings of the crop, and now I'm presented with a crosshair that I can click and drag an area that I'd like to crop. Once my crop is set, I could, as we did before, simply send this to an output node, or I can chain that together with a variety of processing nodes. So maybe what I'd like to do is then resize this. So I can go to a resize node, and I can take my crop to resize, open up the resize, and now I can do whatever I'd like to do. So I can, for example, double the width and height, which I can do in a couple of different ways. One is I can simply do the math in my head, which I'm not very good at, so I'll skip over that. The other way is using some arithmetic expressions that we go over in the class. In this case, I'm going to say input width times 2, which means double the width. But we'll notice the height is all skewed. I'd like to do the same thing to the height. So I could do that again by typing in the doubled value of the height, or with simple arithmetic expressions. Or I can click on the Maintain Aspect Ratio button, which simply maintains the ratio relative to what I'm doing on the width. So this says double the width and do the same thing to the height. I'm going to again choose nearest neighbor as my interpolation method and say OK. I could go to any number of chained outputs. So for example, if I wanted to go and pad this or blur this, I can connect this up to blur. Obviously, this doesn't really make much sense to want to blur this, but just showing that we can chain these together into any variety of outputs. I'm going to then delete that again. Or what we can now do is, what I'd like to do in this case is clarify this by frame averaging all of my iframes. So to do that, I'm going to include an advanced process to extract frames. The extract frames node basically filters out the input frames and only sends a selected type of frame to the output. So I can select from my frame type iframes. I could also say every nth frame to pick every, for example, second frame or every third frame if it's necessary. But in this case, I'm going to use all iframes. And then I'm going to send that to an advanced process that frame averages the incoming frames. So I'm going to direct that to frame average, go into the settings of frame average, and simply give the output folder a name. I'll call this average. We can also align all of the incoming images. This particular example has a static camera that does not move. However, if I had a moving handheld camera, like a cell phone or a police body-worn camera, we can check the Align Images option, which will automatically align all of the images to the background. For this example, I'm going to keep that unchecked, and I'm going to say execute. Very quickly here, we're going to have a new file in our output directory that is a frame averaged and resized view of the original file. So we can already see that this is significantly clarified. However, if I wanted to do additional processing to this, I can throw that into anything like Photoshop or GIMP or any other tool, and I can take that file once Photoshop wakes up and apply a simple levels adjustment with Control-L and change the levels of this file to get a much better view of that original image. So to go back again at what we were dealing with originally, this is the original frames, how they look, and this is what we can get with not more than about 30 seconds of a workflow. If this particular workflow were something that I wanted to do repeatedly, like for example, let's say I wanted to get rid of the crop node, but what I'd like to do frequently is resize by doubling the width and height, extract iframes, and frame average, I can save this workflow by clicking on Workflow Actions, selecting Save, and I'll call this double size and average. And now this new double size and average option is available in the drop-down for all of the workflows that I've saved in the past. So we can see this is one that I built previously, and then we've got our double size and average workflow. That will persist through any instance of iNPUT-ACE. So if you close iNPUT-ACE and reload, that will still be there. And if you want to share that with other users in your office or other users that are at a different office, we can export that workflow by selecting Workflow Actions Export. And I'll just call this double and average. And in my outputs directory, I've got a double and average.workflow file that's a total of about 2 kilobytes that can be emailed to any other user and then ingested into their iNPUT-ACE using the Workflow Actions import action. All right, we're about 15 minutes or so from the end here, so I'm going to start speeding things up a little bit. I'm going to clear out my workflow and clear out the file list. Another way of doing that is by selecting Project Actions, New Project. That's going to clear everything related to the project. And a project are all items in the file list, any subclips, any ins and outs, and markers, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as the organization of those items in the file list. So Project Actions, New, and I'm not going to save the changes. It's going to clear out everything there, and then I can clear out my workflow by simply selecting that and saying Delete. All right, so back on the Interrogate tab here, I'm going to add in another set of files to help articulate a process that is a difference between our consuming nodes and our iterative nodes. So I'm going to take these files, select them all, drag them into the file list, and we can see that when I interrogate the files, we have a timestamp on these images that play back on the first clip starting at about 1:44:22. And the end of the clip ends here at about 1:45:32. The next clip starts off right about where that one leaves off and goes for just about 30 seconds or a minute and then ends before the next one picks up. This particular case involved the drowning of a child in the pool, and the question at hand was the supervision at the pool. And tracking the various parties involved was a very significant challenge because of how broken up all these clips were. So instead, what we'd like to do is combine all of these clips into one continuous file, and that process can be done through the Workflow tab under the Advanced Processes option for concatenating. So concatenate takes all of the inputs, combines them into a back-to-back output so we can more effectively view these files. So I'm going to take that group, I'm going to connect it to concatenate, and I'm going to send that to any output that I'd like. In this case, what I'm going to do is go to MP4 for a deliverable purpose, and I'll talk about what these settings are in just a second once I've done processing this clip. I'm going to go to an output folder right here that I'm going to call concatenate. I'm going to say OK with the defaults, which I will again articulate here shortly, and then say execute. When this is done in my outputs directory, I'm going to have a single file that plays through all of the images in question all within one output file. So this might take a couple seconds, and while this is processing, I'll articulate here what this output setting for lossless H.264 is doing. The H.264 transcode setting is a very dynamic encoder that allows us to have control over how heavily compressed the images are. This compression slider here for compression quality, when all the way at the very far left under lossless compression, is going to produce pixel for pixel an output that is identical to the original file. It's a very powerful way of producing files that are in a normal file format that can be played with normal players like VLC or Windows Media Player, but has a lower file size than something like an uncompressed file. So for example, if I were to hash every single frame of video from a lossless H.264 output relative to the original file and relative to an uncompressed AVI, all three files would have the exact same hash for every single frame of video. Obviously, the actual files themselves would be a different hash because the file sizes would be different, but if you hashed every single decoded frame, they're identical, pixel for pixel. The compression speed slider here does not change the quality of the output. It simply changes how fast that file is going to be produced. So the option to the far left is going to be a much slower process. It's going to take longer to produce it, but it's going to create a smaller file size. All the way to the left is going to produce a much faster file. It's going to get done much more quickly, but the file size is going to be larger, and then therefore the bit rates will also be higher. All right, let's go take a look at the file that's been produced. So in my outputs directory, I can now play that file in anything I want. So here is the file playing back to back to back with the exact same quality as the original file, all the way through all of the events in question. All right, so what I'd like to talk about now is a slightly different process that's happening under the hood when going through a concatenate option versus something like a resize. So if I were to take that group and send that also to a resize and then to the output, for example, what's happening here is we're splitting our input and saying, hey, take the group and go to concatenate and go to an output to MP4. Also take that group and go to resize and go out to MP4. The concatenate option, I delete those line segments right now, is going to consume all of the inputs and write one single output file. The reason for that is concatenate falls under a node type of a consuming node. There's only two other node types that are consuming. The canvas editor is consuming and the merge stream is consuming. So if that file, if any files go into a consuming node, it's going to only produce one file on the output. So concatenate produces one file, canvas editor produces one file, and merge streams would produce one file. All of the other nodes, for example, resize, deinterlace, pad, crop, or any of the other ones under the advanced processes, are going to iterate the action and create the same number of output files as there are inputs. So this is going to produce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different outputs that are all resized, whereas concatenate is going to produce one file, no matter how many inputs there are into it. All right, so once we've gone over this here, I am running a little bit over, so I'm going to gloss over a couple of other segments. So I'm going to skip over, I think, the macro block analysis portion of this webinar, as well as the multi-stream portion. We can see that if I drag a file with multiple streams in, we can see that there are multiple streams inside the video streams here identified on the file list. And we can also, when interrogating the file, can toggle through those streams by cycling the streams using the cycle video stream option here. But again, I am going a little bit over, so I'm going to cut this a bit short. We could process those out by, for example, selecting all the different streams and connecting them to a resize node and then out to an output. And this would process all those streams out to the new files. Feel free to contact me offline if you have questions about that. It's also in the manual. And the manual can be accessed through the top right-hand corner of the UI under the Help section under User Manual. Most of your questions will be answered in there, but again, feel free to contact us after the webinar here if you have specific questions. So I'd like to wrap up this webinar with is a very important understanding of what an iNPUT-ACE project is. So I'm going to create a new project and walk through the organization of a project. We'll see here, I've got 3 different files that are all part of a work request to track and identify a shooter in a bar. So I'm going to drag these 3 files into my file list. We'll see that I've got a group named here that I can rename using my settings option here. And I'm going to name this group something like Original Media. We can also see that in the top right-hand corner of the UI, I have red text that identifies an untitled project. That's because I've got a new project that I have not yet saved. So the first thing that I'm going to do when starting a new project is under Project Actions, select Save or Save As. And for now, I'm going to put this onto my desktop just as an example. And I'll call this bar shooting. And we now have a new project called bar shooting that can be reloaded at any later date. So if I were to close down iNPUT-ACE, relaunch iNPUT-ACE, come into my project actions and select load, I can double click on the project bar shooting and it will reload all of the media in the file. So what I'm going to do now really quick here is identify some characters that are important in this particular case and then very quickly make some subclips, select some markers, get everything to play back side by side, and write a narrative report all within about 5 or 6 minutes. So scrubbing through here, these individuals here are identified as potential aggressors in a fight, and the individual in the blue shirt here is our suspect. This camera right here on the top of the file list shows the events on the left-hand side. And if I come down here to the very bottom clip, we can see the camera that is directly to the right of that. So the camera we were looking at previously is roughly over here, looking down into this area. We can see this pillar is an area of overlap between this camera and this camera. That's the same pillar. So as the individuals walk from this camera perspective into view of the other camera, we should see them come into view roughly at about 1:12:56 or so. So if I come over to about 1:12:56, we'll see the individuals walk into view of the camera. You'll notice here that what I'm going to refer to as male number 1 ends up removing an object from his waist. That object is believed to be a gun as he leans forward and then the crowd reacts to what is allegedly a gunshot. We'll see him then leave the bar covering his right hand and exiting. So what I'm going to do very quickly here is mark some key images, create some subclips, and produce a report. So let's go back to our camera, or the left-hand camera here, and go mark an in at roughly 1:12:50. And I'm going to mark my in at the very first frame of 1:12:50. So if I go forward a frame, we see 1:12:50, back a frame, we see 49. So I'm going to mark that as an in, and I'm going to go past the events to about 1:13:30 and mark an out. I'm going to make a subclip, and I'm going to simply call this left camera and say OK. And I'm going to do now the same thing on the right-hand camera. So at 1:12:50, I'm going to go back to that first instance of 1:12:50. Right there's the first frame. I'll mark my in. I'll scrub forward to about 1:13:30. Mark my out. Hit my subclip. I'll call this right camera. Say OK. And then I'll look at my third camera here that we have, which is the exit camera, and I'll do the exact same thing again. So 1:12:50, the very first frame. I'll mark my in. I'll go to 1:13:30 and mark an out. I'll just call this exit. And now what I'm going to do is combine all of those together into a canvas. That can be done on the Workflows tab under Advanced Processes, Canvas Editor. When I now direct those subclips to the Canvas Editor and look inside the settings, this is going to automatically tile these different files so that they're playing back inside of a canvas. And I can move around these files so they can play back however they'd like, however I want them to. And luckily we'll see here, I like the organization of this frame being in the top left. We'll see the individuals walking into view of the right-hand camera and then exiting on this camera. So I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to process this to, how about a lossless H.264. I'll go fast just to make this more quick. I'm going to stop syncing Dropbox here. And I'm going to direct that output here to my outputs folder, and I'll just call this Canvas. And then say OK. Connect the Canvas editor to the output MP4 and say execute. So back in my outputs directory, we've now got a new file that's a canvas of all of the events. So let's take a quick look at all of this and see if we can have a better understanding of the events that occur. So as I play this forward, we see the individuals from that group approach, enter the right-hand camera. This individual here is the first to strike, but we see what appears to be a dark object in male one's hand during the time of the gunshot. And then he exits, and we see him leave. So this is a very quick and effective way of, number one, giving a demonstrable exhibit to an investigator so they can have a better understanding of what's occurring, all within a very quick time frame. But we can also use that as part of our narrative report. So I'm going to drag that item into my file list, go back to the Interrogate tab, and I'm going to now mark some key images and give descriptions to those images. So let's go take a look at the first instance of when we see male number one in kind of clear view, which is right about here. And I'm going to use my M key to create a marker. I'll call this first image of male 1. And in fact, I'm going to give the same description as the name. So I just copied and pasted that here as a description. When I say OK, I see a couple of different things. First, I see a new group called Marked Images, and I see a new item in that group called First Image of Male 1. I also see a red line identifying that that frame is a marked frame, and I can see the text here in my timeline. I'm going to now go forward into roughly the area where the shots occur, and I'm going to back up the frame to where we see the object in male 1's hand. I'm going to mark that frame with the M key, and I'll say object. And then I'll call the description from the left-hand camera, and camera, a dark object can be seen in male 1's right hand, period. So again, we've got that marked image and the text here in the timeline. I can toggle back and forth between all marked images using the plus and minus key on my keyboard. So I'll mark one more image from this camera, probably like that one right here, and I'll call that one hand under shirt. And I'll give the description here, male 1 moves his right hand under his shirt. Something very generic like that. There's a couple of different things that I can now do with all these marked frames. Number one, I could simply click on this Export Marked Frames as Images button, which will immediately, I'll throw this to my desktop for example, I'll just say Images, and that will immediately send all 3 of those images to my desktop. So now I could send those to whoever I needed to. Again, we can see all marked frames. Or I can do some more complicated things within the iNPUT-ACE interface. which I'll show after marking a couple extra images from the right-hand camera. So from the right-hand camera here, let's go play forward, roughly to the time where he removes the object from his waist. Maybe right there. I'll say reaches for object, and then say male 1 reaches for object waist. Waist. That's very how to spell waist. W-A-I-S-T. There we go. Okay, so for the sake of expediting this, we could mark any number of extra images, but what I'm going to now do is create a narrative PDF report with all of those items embedded within a couple of simple clicks. The narrative report can be accessed through the Tools page under Narrative Report. And we'll notice that there's some default information that can get filled out for example, the agency information and the author name. I'm going to go to my Profile tab, and I'm going to create a new profile to autofill some of those options. So I'm going to give a first name of my name, Andrew. I'll say last name, Fredericks. Title is Certified Forensic Video Analyst. And agency name, I'm going to put in some generic stuff, maybe our address, etc. Section name if necessary, and a signature file if needed. When I say save, when I now go over to my Tools page Narrative Report, I can see all that information got filled in automatically over here. That profile can then be reloaded at any later time when iNPUT-ACE is launched. We can also, from our Interrogate tab or our Workflow tab, add items to the Narrative Report by clicking on the option from the Narrative Report section here. So all I'm going to do is simply add all of my marked images by clicking on the Narrative Report button. We can now see each of those options get added here in the Narrative Report along with their description in a text field. And I can even go and add the Canvas editor item that I created as well. If I wanted to, I could add more items, but for the sake of making this process happen more quickly, I'm going to leave just these inside of here. But what we can also do is add some headings which are going to appear in the output PDF as a bolded option in the top left-hand corner of the page. So to articulate slightly more further what we're doing here, I'm creating a title page that includes this information at the beginning of my report, and then I'm now adding a new item for a heading, which is going to say something like observations. Within that heading are all these different items. I'm going to create a new heading right here. I'm going to move that above my Canvas editor, and I'll call this combined clips. And then maybe I'll add a new text here as well that says something like, see below for a demonstrative. Hey, so demonstrative. Demonstrative. There we go. Of the events from all angles. Now I'll fill out my title page with a case number. I'll just call this case number 1234, and the report title, we'll call this bar shooting as a generic thing. And now before I process this report, we'll notice that in the top right-hand corner of my UI, I've got the bar shooting as red text. The red text means that that particular project is not currently saved. I've changed things since the last time it was saved. So I'm going to go into Project Actions and select Save. Control S does the exact same action. And now I'm going to simply generate the report. We'll put it to our desktop and we'll call it bar shooting. And this is now writing all of those exhibits into a self-contained PDF file that contains all of my images and my Canvas editor clip, all organized in a very clean format that can be handed off and distributed very easily. So here it is. It's automatically launched. I'll go Control L here to pop this in full screen. And we can see that my title page is organized with the information that I gave it originally. And we'll see here now that I've got my observations header with my image and the description that was given originally for that marked image. If I click on the image, this is going to automatically launch the raw, uncompressed bitmap image inside of Windows Photo Viewer. So again, attorneys or investigators can very easily go through this and see the original image in its highest quality format simply by clicking on that inside the narrative report. So here they can read along with your observations and get a better understanding of what's occurring. We've also got, as we did before here, the combined clips header with the text that we added to the report. And when I click on this option now, it's going to launch it up in VLC or whatever's playing MP4 files on the user's computer. And now they can very quickly watch those same events directly from the PDF report. So again, here in about 5 minutes, we've created a demonstrative exhibit that is adding some significant value to this case, all within one simple UI. Let's take a quick look here at a more complicated example of how these can get organized, and then I'm going to wrap up and leave room for any questions that anyone might have. So I can go now load a new project, and I've actually got a project that was created previously here under ID Miller. So I'm going to go project actions load, and I'm going to go browse to this directory here. I'm just going to copy this and paste that here, and let's load this other project. So we'll see that our narrative report is getting built just as it was saved previously. And then we'll go over to our workflow or our interrogate tab, and we'll see all of the groups and clips that we had loaded when this project was last saved. We can reinterrogate any of these files and watch them right from within the file list. This particular case involved I'm going to go find the other in-car video here. Let's play this clip here. Let me find the correct one that shows the actions here in a slightly better view. Case 6-7, I believe it is. So this individual here that we see ahead, it's now parked off on the side, was taking shots out of his car at random pedestrians. So the police get involved in the chase. He's swerving in and out of oncoming traffic, and then they end up shooting his car with about 84 shots. The main question in this case was who shot first. The family was suing the city, alleging that the police had opened fire on his vehicle and that he hadn't shot. So by organizing everything in iNPUT-ACE, by creating a bunch of marked images and subclips, we're able to, within a narrative report, very easily outline the events and generate the report all within a simple click. This particular report has a lot of additional content in it, so it takes about 5 minutes to produce. I'm just going to go launch one that we produced previously and go through how this can get organized in a more complicated example. In this case, we have a summary articulating some of the events, all of the exhibits produced, and then the analysis. So again, just like on the last case, we're going to start off with a canvas editor showing the events. So I'm going to sit here and click this one. Let's just play through so we can see the events. The officer here is the same camera as the in-car video. He's actually trailing behind the car, driving with his gun facing out the window. And as he opens fires through the window, we'll see the car drive off and come to a stop. Yeah, it's still not quite done yet. They keep going. Okay, so that was about 88 shots in a very quick period of time. And if we roll back the file here, the question at hand really is there evidence of a shot fired by this individual at about this time when he's swerving? He was allegedly gripping his steering wheel with a handgun in his hand, taking shots out the window. And as he lost control, there's what appears to be a shot fired coming from his vehicle, and we can show through the alignment that no other vehicle was firing at that point in time. So let's now go take a look at some of that. We again here have all of the other vehicles as subclips with a description of what they show. And towards the end of the report, we have a sequence of images that show uncompressed views that can be clicked and again viewed in Windows Media Viewer to take a look at those events. So right at this point in time here, at about 11:01:26, we see a flash coming from the vehicle, a vertical line. If we compare that with the bullet marks that are in the window, we can see that it lines up with the marking that is right here, which is identified by the police as Exhibit F, or Marker F, which is then confirmed by a gunshot expert to show that that is the one that would have had an exit from the vehicle. So again, we've organized all of this, sent it off to the client, and it was a very, very quick and easy process. All right, there's a lot more to cover within iNPUT-ACE on the macro block analysis tab, as well as how to effectively use some of these interrogate options and other options in the workflow tab. But I hope that this will at least get you started and give you a ability of getting hands-on and effectively using this for either your 30-day trials or if you've just purchased and are still waiting to schedule a training date. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up and leave room for any questions you might have. So please feel free to ask, and I'll make sure I address those before we conclude. All right, so I've got a question here about how to reload the projects. There's a section in the manual that articulates a means of properly saving the location of the project file so that they can be reloaded at later dates more easily. So the purpose of that, and I'll articulate that right here under the case that we went over called full case with these 3 AVIs. I'm going to make a new folder called media, and I'm going to put that data in there to articulate why we normally organize stuff in a different way. So I'm going to go project actions, new project to clear this out. And under media, I'm going to add those items to my file list. When we save this project, the best location to save the project is 1 level down from the media. So right here in this directory. I'll show you why. So if I say save, and I go back to this location, and I just call this like test project. We've got our project here and our media 1 level down. When I reload that project, the project file is basically a pointer that is looking to the media inside of C, users, desktop, etc. under media. If I want to move that media to a new directory, iNPUT-ACE would not be able to find that content. So watch what happens if I move the media to my desktop. I'm just going to click and drag that off. So media is now on my desktop. If I go project actions load and I load the same project, those items won't be found, and they're going to be highlighted in red, meaning that iNPUT-ACE cannot find those files. The reason that I wanted to save the media 1 level down from the project is that if I move the 2 files together, in other words, if I keep the project and the media in the same relative location from one another, and I move that to my desktop, so now I've got my project and my media here on the same location, 1 level down from each other. When I go into iNPUT-ACE and I say load, and I browse to my desktop and I select that test, now they will reload successfully and I can interrogate those files. So that's why the manual articulates saving your project files 1 level down from the media. Okay, we've got another couple questions here. And let me make sure that I can expand my window so I can see this a little bit easier. All right, so I've got one question about what is the S hotkey in the interrogation window. The S hotkey is to create a subclip between an in and an out mark. So if you create an in and an out with the I key and the O key, excuse me, the I key and the O key, the S key is going to create that subclip between those periods of time. Another question about hotkeys being are hotkeys necessary? No, they are not always necessary. A lot of the actions can be done within the UI. So for example, if I wanted to frame step, you can do that this way. However, to mark an in and an out, yes, those are hotkey only currently. We have had a couple requests to make those mouse clickable options, so that's something that we'll likely be doing very shortly here. I myself am I find myself more effective using the hotkeys, but because of those requests, we'll certainly get that in. We've been on about a once every 2 weeks update process where we're getting user requested features out the door very, very quickly. So please do not hesitate to send us requests, and we're happy to get those done as quickly as possible. If you encounter any either issues with the software, like if you run into something that you don't think should have happened, or if you have feature requests, the best way to do that is to go into the Help menu and select Submit Feedback. When you click Submit Feedback, you can give some additional information about what it is that's occurring. So if it's an issue you encountered, you can say, hey, I performed the following steps and saw this issue. So then you can give us some steps and say generate error report, and that is going to give us a .feedback file. Just call this error.feedback. And then it would automatically launch your email client, which I don't have on this computer, but if you had Outlook, it would auto-launch that. And then you'll see a feedback report right here that you can email to us. When you email us that feedback report, we're able to see additional information about some of the actions and activity as a log that was occurring within iNPUT-ACE. All of your data is kept safe. We don't see anything about the case or anything like that, but we will see some of the technical programming level stuff that was occurring, which will help us much more quickly and effectively track down the source of the problems you encountered. So please, if you encounter issues or have requests, send us those feedback reports, and we will be able to very quickly get those updated into future releases of the software. Okay, I'll leave a couple of additional seconds for any additional questions, and then we'll be able to wrap it up here. So I've got another question about the narrative reports and the format of the embedded files. So if we take a look here at the example that we were using before, this relatively large project with a lot of embedded media is about 300 meg. Usually if it's a smaller case where all we're using are a series of images or a couple of subclips, the file size is going to be significantly smaller. But all of the content, all of the videos, and all of the embedded images are all self-contained within this file. So the video links are visually lossless H.264. So they are not the perfectly lossless H.264. There is some measurable loss if in something like Photoshop, but visually with our eyes, this is visually going to be the same as the original. It's a very easy way of distributing it as well, because now we can send this off as a PDF as opposed to needing some other file format or player for the individual to play the files in. However, the images are lossless bitmaps. So these are the original image, the same as if we were to extract a bitmap from the player. Okay, I hope that answers that question. If you need additional clarification on that one, feel free to articulate that in the chat log. Okay, well, I think that wraps up the questions here. Again, if you have any further questions or anything else you'd like to know, do not hesitate to email us, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. Thank you again for attending the webinar. If you'd like a recording of the webinar, please also don't hesitate to ask us, and we'd be happy to send that to you. Thanks again, and I look forward to discussing with you further. Bye-bye.